Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Chelsea Foxwell, and as the director of the Center for East Asian Studies here at the University of Chicago, it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's special program with the Honorable Mark Lippert, former U.S. Ambassador to the Republic of Korea. The Center for East Asian Studies, known by its acronym CEAS or CEAS, is proud to co-sponsor this event with the International House. CEAS serves as an interdisciplinary nexus and clearinghouse for East Asian studies and is an important resource for faculty and students across the University of Chicago. CEAS supports academic activities, research, K through 16 outreach, and public events to promote greater understanding of China, Japan, and Korea. For more information and to sign up to receive the CEAS weekly e-bulletin, please visit our website, ceas.uchicago.edu. CEAS frequently partners with International House and other entities, both on and off campus, to provide outstanding programs, and we believe tonight is one of them. Tonight's program is one of many held annually by International House as part of their Global Voices Lecture Series programs. The Global Voices Lecture Series hosts prominent speakers, roundtable discussion groups, and special interest conferences and seminars. As part of this program, leading figures from the world stage come to share their thoughts and exchange ideas with students and members of Chicago's civic community on major issues facing the country and the world. Tonight's program perfectly fits that Global Voices description. From the day International House opens its doors 91 years ago, their mission has been to promote cross-cultural understanding, mutual respect, and friendship among international students, scholars, and the community. That mission is made manifest through programs like today's, and that mission guides the work of the 15 other international houses around the world. Now onto the main event. We're fortunate to have Ambassador Mark Lippert join us tonight to engage in conversation with Michael Kulma on U.S., Japan, and Korea relations. Please note that after the conversation, there will be time for you to ask questions during our Q&A session, and the Q&A will be followed by a reception. The Honorable Mark William Lippert is Executive Vice President, Head of North American Public Affairs, and Chief Risk Officer for Samsung Electronics North America. He joined Samsung after executive positions at Google, YouTube, and the Boeing Company. He is Senior Advisor to the KSIS Korea Chair, where he holds bi-weekly webcasts entitled The Capital Cable on the geopolitics and economics of the Korean Peninsula and Northeast Asia. He's the Vice Chairman of the Board of Directors of the Halifax Forum and is on the Board of Directors of the Korea Society. Our interlocutor tonight, Michael Kulma, is the Head of Programs and Communications at International House. His previous roles include Senior Director for Global Programs and Leadership Initiatives at NAFSA, Association of International Educators, Associate Vice President of Global Engagement at the University of Chicago, and Executive Director of Global Leadership Initiatives at the Asia Society. Michael holds a PhD in political science with a focus on Chinese foreign policy. Without further ado, please welcome our speakers.
Thank you very much, Chelsea, and thank you to Abby, Connie, and the rest of the CEAS team. As always, we're delighted to be working with you all on tonight's program. As Chelsea suggested at the beginning part, Mark and I are going to be sitting here and talking a little bit, having a little bit of a conversation. That'll be followed by Q&A from all of you, so feel free to be thinking about the questions as we go along. And then afterwards, Mark will be around for a little bit and whatnot, and you can have a little bit of a brief one-on-one conversations to the extent that people have follow-up questions. Mark, if you don't mind, well, first off, thanks so much for coming here.
Absolutely.
We're delighted to have you back on campus. Mark was here as a freshman a long time ago, and while he didn't stay here for the entire 4 years, he has a deep affinity for the place and has a sister who went to school here as an undergrad as well. So we're happy to have you back on campus, Mark. I'd like to add a few extra points on your background, if you don't mind, if you'll allow me, as I think our students in particular might be interested in kind of that career trajectory. I know we're going to talk about content here on the U.S., Japan, and Korea, but your career is an interesting one, and it provides also, I think, further context for the comments that you'll make as we go through the conversation and the questions from others. So, in addition to what Chelsea has suggested, you've also held multiple senior positions at the Department of Defense. You've served in the Navy. You've worked on the NSC under President Obama, and you worked on the Hill, also with then Senator Obama's as his foreign policy advisor. So perhaps we'll circle back to some of that. Maybe some of the students might have interest in some of those kinds of questions, but I think it just provides an even broader context of what of all you bring to this conversation, which is just immense experience in talking about the issues that we're here to talk about today.
Well, I'm glad we're looking at it glass half full, because my mother, who's from Norton, Kansas, basically says I can't hold a job. So that's the, but that's, that's mine to bear.
Well, we'll send her the videotape afterwards and whatnot, so that she knows that you know exactly what you're talking about here. So I'll just start with kind of a big opening question, which is really around the topic of discussion today. So last August, President Biden, Prime Minister Kishida, and President Yoon met at Camp David. Right? This is the first ever standalone summit of leaders from the U.S., Japan, and South Korea. Japan and Korea are two long-standing allies, have great relationships, generally speaking, with the United States, and they all have strong economic ties together. But there are some really good reasons as to why this was the first ever standalone summit. Can you provide some context? Why has it taken the leaders of these three countries so long to meet? And why was the timing right in 2023 to make that happen?
Yeah, it's a great question. Just again, thanks for having me here, to all the staff, the faculty, and thanks for turning out to this. And it is great to be back at the University of Chicago. It's such a, and just digress for 1 second. You know, the thing that probably drove me away most was my time here playing third base for the Chicago Maroons during our 1992 5-win, 30-loss campaign. So I just decided probably have. It's time for a replacement at the hot corner. So anyway, look, this is a long, complicated issue, and I know people in this room have varying degrees of expertise. Some people know a lot more about this than I will ever know. Some people are new to this, so I'll try to meet in the middle and vector me the right way. Why is the Korean relationship with Japan, or relationship, why is it so scratchy? It basically boils down to a long, complicated history, most recently Japanese colonization of Korea from around the turn of the century, 1905, to the end of World War II. And that was a very, very tough period for the South Korean population. It's still relatively recent. And it finds its way also into domestic politics in South Korea. So it's a very salient, potent issue in South Korea. And it's a very painful, understandably so, tough issue for South Koreans, given the colonial history there, which was very, very difficult and tough. So that is what undergirds a lot of the complexities in the relationship between Seoul and Tokyo. That's one. Why now? I think there was a lot of, I would say, ballyhoo, much of it placed on the first standalone summit. It was a remarkable summit. Camp David, the three leaders together, the language there without precedent, very, very important. Having said that, I think it's important to recognize that there was a trajectory of improving relations over the last 10 to 15 years. Now, those relations would wax and wane, depending on government in Seoul and Tokyo, depending on the political situation, depending on the U.S. role. The U.S. role is really, really important, and when the U.S. doesn't play an active role in facilitating, not knocking heads, not forcing everybody together, but reminding the two sides it's really important for them, and finding constructive ways to help facilitate rather than, I would say, direct intervention, the U.S. also has a player. So those things came together in 2023. They were building, though, with a series of what I would say conservative governments in South Korea, especially when the conservatives were in power, to get to that end. And why do I say that? Well, you start with Lee Myung-bak, who obviously was president of Korea about a decade plus ago, and he got very close on what was called a JSOMIA agreement, an intelligence sharing agreement with Japan. That agreement ultimately fell apart at the 11th hour, but it was something then that I think was marked as a possible accomplishment that could drive the two sides closer. Park Geun-hye, the next conservative president of South Korea, entered office after Lee Myung-bak and took up the mantle and did two things. One, reached an agreement with Prime Minister Abe on the comfort women, the Wianbo, on an agreement there, on a government-to-government agreement, number one. And it was controversial in Korea. And I think some people to this day are upset about that. And understandably so, but it did drive the sides closer. And then she followed that up quickly by ultimately obtaining the intelligence sharing agreement that eluded Lee Myung-bak. And so you have that going on, or that piece. Now, there was backsliding when Moon Jae-in, the president, came into South Korea, the progressive president, President Trump. Things moved over to North Korea, symmetry. It was sort of, there wasn't a lot going on there. Things got a little scratchy. But re-enter the current South Korean president, Yoon Suk-yeol. And oh, by the way, the prime minister, sitting prime minister in Japan, is Kishida, who was the foreign minister during the time of Park Geun-hye, and that those deals on JSOMIA and the comfort women were reached. So you have a prime minister who knows his way around these issues. You have Yoon Suk-yeol, who then hired a number of Park Geun-hye and Lee Myung-bak's advisors. The national security advisor who just left to go be the head of the intelligence directorate, Cho Tae-young, was the deputy national security advisor under Park Geun-hye. The current deputy also served as deputy under Lee Myung-bak. So you had a lot of continuity there, and then the Biden administration made it a priority. And those pieces coming together are the reason, after a lot of hard work and a lot of back and forth between the sides, that's why we had the summit, the first standalone summit, and the unprecedented nature of much of the language around it in 2023. Okay.
I want to eventually get back into kind of the local politics or the domestic politics in each of these three countries for discussion. But since you mentioned kind of the unprecedented nature of the joint statement and the things that we're committed to, what happened? I mean, what did they commit to doing, and kind of where do we stand 6 months later?
So I guess what I would say is I think a lot of people were extremely, I would say, if you say 1 to 10, a lot of people were 15 on this summit. I'm kind of at a 9, and because you get, and I think it was a great summit, and like I said, there was a lot of unprecedented language. But what they agreed to is interesting, because they agreed to more process, meetings every year, more consultation, all of that. And I think the key for me, and I think I would not put words into my colleague at CSIS, Victor Cha's mouth, but we have both talked about on the record on our webcast that to get to the next level, we have to get concrete outcomes from the summit, right? And Victor has some ideas about possibly an understanding of how the security relationship would work. General Brooks, who was the former United States Forces Korea commander and former Army component commander of Pacific Command, thinks we should stand up Far East Command again. But there are some ideas on how to take those next steps and where to cement, I would say, concrete deliverables. And finally, I was at a conference earlier this year. Actually, it's early December 2023, not earlier this year. But there was a lot of discussion among Korean and Japan experts and prominent Korean, Japanese former officials about what those next steps might be. Because I think that's important. Like, you've got a good process framework, you've got a lot of momentum, you have recent history moving in the right direction in fits and starts, but generally moving that way. That next piece is absolutely critical of what will come next. And I think that's what I, as a Korea watcher, am following closely.
Can I ask you to look into the crystal ball and say, well, what are those next steps that if you, I mean, you've done a lot of this work, you've advised leaders here in the United States. What would be some of those next steps that you'd like to see that would show the kind of real solidifying of this trilateral relationship?
I mean, I guess what I would go is, look, I would talk more in buckets, right? You probably need, everybody's interested in the security bucket. What does that look like, especially with the dual threats that confront South Korea and Japan? And they're different in nature, and they have different views of them. But obviously, North Korea is an imminent threat, proximate threat, all of that. There's also, threat, however you want to couch the language, or at least competitor in the Chinese. And there has to be accounting for that as well. And so I think you need something in the security bucket. And is that some sort of joint command structure? Is it more exercises? You just need something there. I'm also a big believer where I have said publicly, and this is probably the thing that I like the most, is what I would call the alignment and cooperation on 4 or 5 key sensitive technologies, right? Because when you start stripping away what all of this is about in Asia in terms of this geopolitical tension or geoeconomic race with the Chinese that the U.S. seems so consumed with these days, a lot of it comes down to core technologies, right? Where you are on EV batteries, supercomputer, quantum, semiconductors. We all know that list. And the Japanese have some core elements that are really, really attractive. The South Koreans have a number of core elements that are very attractive. The U.S. also has that. How can we come up with a common list? Where can we work together? And what might a trilateral, at least maybe if you can't get trilateral projects, but coordination on those elements. And then finally, look, I've always been a fan of some of what I would call the new frontiers, pushing out beyond the traditional economic and security fronts. And I would put, if you could get a couple of things in these buckets, global health, space, fourth industrial revolution, right, environment, energy, in there, cooperation there would be just, I think, really, really important going forward. So let me just stop there. And let me just add one thing quickly. I should have done a disclaimer. I'm speaking only as on behalf of myself, not on behalf of any of the affiliations that I hold. So I just had to get that disclaimer as well. I'm speaking only as a private citizen and not a representative of any particular organization. So let me stop there.
Okay, great. No, well, thanks for laying it out kind of in those broad perspectives and then diving a little bit deeper. So on the one hand, obviously, this conversation is about U.S., Japan, and Korea. That's the way we've put that out there to everybody. On the other hand, there are other countries, and you've already started to reference them, who could be seen on the other side of that coin, right? China, Russia, and North Korea probably most particularly in that conversation. On the China front, I think for a long time, China, it can be seen as benefiting from kind of the security environment that was created in the region, at least partially facilitated by U.S. alliances. In more recent times, it's begun to strain against the boundaries of that. It wants to stretch its presence in Asia and beyond. China was specifically mentioned, though, in the joint statement, particularly as it relates to China's, and I quote, dangerous and aggressive behavior supporting unlawful maritime claims in the South China Sea. So it was really kind of brought out in a very particular way. Leading up to the summit, both China, or I think all of those countries, spoke not overly favorably about this kind of a meeting. What's China's take on these meetings and the current state of relations?
Well, I should be asking you that question.
Yeah.
You're the China expert. Maybe what I would say is on current state of relations first. Maybe take it this way. I think this is you could come at this in a bunch of different ways. What's been interesting in South Korea is the country that I know best out of all of these, and frankly not very well. But what's been interesting is watching the trajectory of South Korean-Chinese relations in in the last 5 to 10 years, right? And first, you start with domestic popular opinion, which is not unimportant in a democracy. And support for Chinese among the Korean people has just fallen off a cliff. It's bottomed out. And it used to be the Chinese would kind of bump around at 40% plus or minus approval and kind of up and down, but it's just been sharp and it's been down and it's stayed down for a little while. That's one. And two, what's been interesting about the relationship is that China, Japan is a noisy subject in South Korea. It's in the papers, it's debated, it's thought of. The U.S. alliance is also noisy. Now, the U.S. is very popular, so it's a little different, but it's noisy. The China issue used to be very quiet, but in the last 5 years, it's gotten much louder, much noisier, much more public. So you have these two dynamics that has shaped the political space in South Korea in a way that has, I think, contributed to a much more, hardline's not the right word, but a more robust stance by the South Korean government towards Beijing, and the language that they're using, the joint statement, also the way they're characterizing the relationship with China, it's much stronger than it has been in the past, right? And part of that also comes down to, I think, the economic drivers, right? The business community in Korea, still does a lot of business in China, but it's changing. And there's been, just like American companies, there's been IP theft over time. There's been the Chinese moving into spaces where the Korean companies are, right? Like shipbuilding, now semiconductors, others. There's that. And then there's been the famous THAAD episode, right, concerning a missile defense battery placed in South Korea, where the Chinese basically retaliated, especially against one conglomerate, Lotte, used direct economic retaliation, and others that have driven the political space in South Korea in a certain direction that has made it more just a much colder relationship between Seoul and Beijing. Let me just stop there, see if you want to vector me in a different way. I don't want to go on too long here, but...
No, well, I want to stay on the China side,
yes,
at least, and whatnot, and we can certainly stay on the Korea side. Because you mentioned the kind of the economic, pieces of this. All of these, the U.S., Japan, and Korea all have a robust economic relations, despite the fact of different things that are going on in the political situation,
yes,
and different tariffs and all. There's still a lot of trade going on between China and all of these different countries. How do they balance that? I mean, you started to kind of address that in your last answer. How do they balance that with the concerns that they have around maritime issues and otherwise?
Yeah, it's a really good point. I think let me put it this way, in Washington, where I spend 3 or 4 days a week, what I've seen is allies, including the Europeans, not limited to the South Koreans and the Japanese, I think much more comfortable with the concept of de-risking, which is in fact a European construct, than they are with decoupling, right? And so then I think once you get from a decoupling conversation, which isn't really an overly realistic construct to begin with, but it's more of on the continuum, more of a maximalist policy. But if you get to a de-risking conversation and you're, to use Jake Sullivan's words, if you're sort of talking about how big or small the yard is and how high the fence is, that's a more comfortable place, I think, for friends, partners, allies of the United States around the world, right? And so that, I think, that tone and tenor of the conversation is much easier for allies to balance, because allies do have different interests and equities in China than the U.S., and it would be crazy if we all had complete alignment. But there are still, I would say, some core interests that are also extant, and what the definitions and boundaries there is a subject of ongoing conversation. And that's why they, used to pay me a small government salary, but gave me a really nice house to figure out those contours. And that's what alliance management is all about. Let me just say one thing. It's a little bit on the career side, but also just, I think, a larger point is like what gets everybody's attention in Washington are these meetings with the Chinese and Jake Sullivan and the 10 people sitting across the table. And those are important. Those conversations are really important. Don't let me detract from that. But what gets much less attention, but is really important, is what people call in D.C. alliance management. And that's working with your allies especially, but friends, partners also, to figure out the contours of that relationship, because one of the great strengths of U.S. foreign policy is obviously its friend, partners, and allies around the world, right? And so the better you are at alliance management, the more leverage you have in these bigger negotiations with, say, the Chinese or others, and the better you are at mustering support for, which I think most administrations espouse as a critical goal, a rules-based international order.
Okay. I want to jump more into the alliance management when we talk a little bit more about domestic politics in each of these countries. But before we move on from China, just one more thing on the Chinese front, and really just back to U.S., the United States. Has there been is any Chinese concern about this summer counterbalanced by the November meeting between Biden and Xi?
Well,
any positives? So there's positives, right? At least, right?
Yeah.
For the longest time, I mean, U.S.-China relations were not in a good spot over the course of the last few years, right? And so the fact that they met, in and of itself, served as a positive thing in the relationship. The idea of getting, their defense ministers back together, having conversations, getting other people at the working levels to have those conversations. Those are generally positive impacts. So is any of that Chinese concern about the summer summit, between the trilateral summit, counterbalanced by the Xi-Biden meeting? Yeah,
and I didn't answer your question, sorry, on the trilateral piece. Look, I would just say to, borrow from Evan Medeiros, who knows way more about China than I would ever do, professor at Georgetown. Look, the Chinese just never are going to be happy with the U.S. alliance system in Asia, right? And the trilateral summit shows strength and purpose behind this sort of web of relationships undergirded by alliances. And so, of course, they're not going to be overly pleased by it. And when the Koreans and the Japanese are getting along, that sends a strong signal to the Chinese. I said that over and over on the record as ambassador and as a public figure. So I think there's that point. Look, I think on the summit, again, I'm borrowing from other China experts, but just to quote a couple of them, I think that both sides, so I'm footnoting heavily because I'm in an academic environment, both sides recognized this was going to be basically the last time that they could get the two leaders together before the Taiwan election and the U.S. election. And if they didn't get together then and put basically a floor or some guardrails around the relationship, or at least help undergird it, both by the run-up to it and the work streams out of it, that you run the risk of getting into a much more dangerous and perilous spot. And I think that was the big outcome of the Biden-Xi summit, was that you basically put a floor, guardrails, put up some work stream, and got the relationship in a more manageable position hitherto.
Okay. Let's move off of China and go into Russia, right? Certainly since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, we've seen Russia get closer to China. They've talked about this, enduring partnership, and it's gotten closer to North Korea as well. What's your take on, Russia's position related to these trilateral meetings?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, lots to unpack there. Maybe just take it slightly different. First, I think what's more interesting is the North Korea-Russia relationship right now, right? And
I was going to ask about North Korea next anyway. So throw them all together.
Yeah. I mean, I think the Russians, it's been interesting. Well, let me just go to North Korea first. I mean, what the big winner in all of this kind of the division on the Security Council and the war in Ukraine has been the North Koreans, right? Because now the North Koreans have hitherto, if you look 2016 to 2019, 18, you have 5 or 6 sectoral-wide UN Security Council resolutions passed unanimously by the Security Council, right? Their diplomatic space is closing. They're facing increased sectoral-wide sanctions. There's a whole bunch of pressure mounting on them, right? And now, fast forward the tape 4 years ago, after summits and all of that, you now have a North Korean situation where the Security Council is hopelessly divided. They are now providing weapons and arms in exchange for hard currency to the Russians. The Russians will probably there's a lot of speculation about what they're providing in kind back, but it can't be. It's got to be a net positive for the North Koreans. So that change in the geopolitical environment has benefited the North Koreans tremendously. The Russians on trilateral summits, I'm sure, they, speaking from experience, they didn't, it wasn't the focus, and I think the Russian angle was generally more, it didn't seem to be as salient as, say, the North Korean reaction or the Chinese reaction. But obviously they have made it a point to also join the Chinese in saying, the U.S. alliance structure is a Cold War structure and all of that. So I think it's kind of drafting in off some of the statements there.
Okay. I hesitate to ask this, based upon what you just said about kind of North Korea and their kind of greater capacity at this stage as opposed to a few years ago. I almost hesitate to ask the next question. But, I feel I'd be remiss in not talking about, are there any solutions or resolutions on the North Korea front given this kind of trilateral relationship now? Of course, years and years ago, we had six-party peace talks and all of these kinds of things. They never got far enough, never really, they eventually kind of faded away and into non-existence and whatnot. Does this trilateral relationship, is that another one of those steps that you could see that there is some possibility to bring some kind of resolution, however you want to define it, to the North Korea situation or to better engage with North Korea?
Yeah, I mean, the North Korea situation is really hard. I mean, it's, I guess to say first, there was a time when the sides did get very close, and it was the agreed framework under Bill Clinton, President Clinton, and I think, had Al Gore won the election, we'd be looking at a very different situation with North Korea, right? Because you basically had, a deal was in place, and my theory of why there was so much openness to a deal was the North Korean regime was under extreme pressure at the time, extreme pressure. And so the North Koreans do respond to pressure and, are transactional in that regard. The six-party talks, obviously didn't work in the end. We can sort of go through the history there. But I think the question is less now about the grouping or the diplomatic arrangement. And I think if you're asking the White House, they would say, what if there's a way we can make progress on this, we are open to it, right? We're less wedded to the diplomatic construct, multilateral, unilateral. But we need a credible interlocutor on the other side of the table in the North that's ready to negotiate. And the North does not appear to be in that posture now, number one. And number two, in fact, is going the opposite direction. And number three, if you talk to Sid Seiler, who's the National Intelligence Officer for North Korea forever and just got out of government, the North Koreans aren't mysterious on this at all. They've telegraphed where they're going, and they've gone that way, and that's where they're headed right now. And I think that's the dilemma. Is there appears to be very little that could slow down that trajectory, at least at the current time.
Okay, I'm not going to go any further down that because that could be another program
that
we bring it back for to try and figure out what to do on the North Korean front. Let's go to domestic politics. You've already alluded to it in a couple of different responses that you've given, but as we know, there's lots of conversation in political circles and whatnot, and more broadly about elections going on throughout the course of this year around the planet. Just a couple of questions around how does domestic politics come into play on this trilateral relationship? And let's start here, right? The U.S. obviously all in full, the presidential election race is in full gear. It's amazingly looking to be a rematch, of course, of 2020. What would this trilateral relationship, what did it look like under the previous presidency? What would it look like under another Biden presidency and under another Trump presidency? And let me just put this in the context of this last week, particularly given former President Trump's statements this week about NATO and alliances and what there may not be a direct, it may not be oranges to oranges, maybe it's oranges to apples, but it strikes me as an important conversation to have and how he's thinking about these things.
Yeah, lots to unpack there.
Take your time.
I guess let's see here. First, I guess you would, if you ask where the Trump team was and where President Trump was on a trilateral formulation and relationship, I don't think it was a priority for the Trump administration. And, I think that was due to a number of factors. But, the President Trump did have a good, strong relationship with Prime Minister Abe. And so there was a lot of emphasis and a lot of conversation in and around the U.S.-Tokyo relationship, right? So that was interesting. And then obviously President Trump went off in an unprecedented way on the North Korea side. And, Moon Jae-in, the progressive president of South Korea, was very interested in that, right? And a very strong supporter of that. So you kind of had these two pieces working in parallel that were not married up, right? And so the trilateral formulation, I think, did not receive robust attention under the Trump administration. I think that's point one. The other thing that on the South Korea side, and to a little bit of a lesser extent on the Japan side, it was more the South Koreans. There was a lot of talk about, obviously, the burden sharing arrangement. Burden sharing is probably, it's such a bad term, but it's what we use in Washington. But it has to do, every 5 years, the U.S. and South Koreans get together and they negotiate how much side each is going to pay for U.S. presence there. And it ends up, tends to be a modest increase. And the two sides have a robust negotiation, not without some heat and friction. But that issue became, and that's generally solved at a lower level, kind of deputy assistant secretary up to the undersecretary, kind of deals with that. That became a presidential issue under the Trump administration and sucked up a lot of time and bandwidth at the leader level about who was going to pay what. So I think the South Koreans are rightly so wondering, if we have a Trump presidency, are we going to have more symmetry? Are we going to have burden sharing? The other thing that was obviously renegotiated was the free trade agreement, right? What's called the KORUS FTA, the Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, that is, really the second, we have the treaty, the Mutual Defense Treaty, and the second real pillar in the U.S.-Korea relationship is the KORUS FTA. And it's, generally still called the gold standard or a gold standard because it's a high standard free trade agreement. And that was renegotiated and was under pressure. So I think the South Koreans are wondering, are we going to go back to those being the centerpieces of the relationship, or are we going to be more in the space where we are in 2024, which is talking about how we're working together around the world, trilateral relationship with the Japanese, and don't forget also, especially in South Korea, integration on the margins, at least, in NATO, right? You asked about NATO, but now there's the AP4, South Korea, Australia, I think New Zealand, and Japan now showing up at NATO meetings on a regular basis, right, and participating in that. So, you have a lot more connecting up with different friends and allies around the world, and I think that's on the mind, I think, of both the South Koreans and Japanese. And let me just stop there, and you can re-vector as appropriate.
We'll be opening up to audience questions in just a little bit, so feel free to continue thinking about what you want to talk to Mark about. Domestic politics on the South Korean and Japanese side, again, you've addressed a little bit about it, but just want to dig a little bit deeper on there. Both President Yoon and Prime Minister Kishida's approval ratings are less than stellar, right? Kind of in at least the things that I've seen in recent times, in the 20 to 30% range. So I guess it gets me back to, do they have the backing for all this? Obviously, they had the presidential and prime ministerial capacity to make this happen. Is there the backing of the people in these efforts to try and bring these countries together and getting back to kind of the historical animosity, particularly between South Korea and Japan? And what are the challenges from political parties at home to this? Just like here, different different parties could lead to changes in the policies. What do we see on the horizon in those places, even though they don't have prime ministerial or presidential elections coming up this year?
Yeah, good question. I mean, look, Kishida was not too long ago, Prime Minister Kishida was riding high in the polls, right? He was doing great, especially by Japanese standards. And obviously he's been racked with a domestic election campaign slush fund scandal. I don't know how to call it, but what to call it exactly. But that has really hurt him, right? And the LDP seems to be reeling from that. But it's still the dominant power, and the success. The other parties are still not overly strong. And if you're asking me, I think there's still a lot of fresh memories within the Japanese public mind of the DPJ rule in 2009 and 2012, which was not popular in Japan and still relatively recent. So, Kishida, the question will be, how does he do internally to the party? How does he come through this scandal? That seems to be what's consuming him now. Obviously and he's got a visit to DC relatively soon. That could be a boost in his popularity, statesman-like, all of that. So I think wait and see. I don't think that the drivers right now of Kishida's popularity are necessarily related to foreign policy. They tend to be more related to these domestic scandals. Yoon Suk-yeol, I think, has sort of ticked up recently. And look, South Korea has just become a pretty polarized electorate, right? The electorate was very close. The election was extremely close between the two sides. What is interesting, though, and I will say, within hours of the polls closing, the votes were counted, the winner was declared, the loser had conceded. So as polarized as it is, it was still a good night for democracy in South Korea. And I think that's important to say there, too. Also, just quickly back to your other point about Asia and democracy, hundreds of millions of Asians will go to the polls this year in Asia. And for all the talk of backsliding of democracy around the world, there's a lot of healthy things to point out in Asia. So just a quick note there. So on the domestic piece going forward, look, their standing is okay, driven by other things. What I would say is what is interesting is some of the polling after the trilateral summit. You did see, I thought, pretty good numbers, 40, 50% support in South Korea, where this tends to be, I thought those were solid numbers for that. And then especially, you start looking at some of the polling in and around millennials and Gen Zs in South Korea, and the published polls show strong support for a better relationship with Japan. And remember, the young voters in South Korea are a key critical swing vote, too. So I think the domestic politics are pretty interesting in this. Having said all that, it's still, especially in South Korea, a very, very tough issue. It's still an emotional issue. And it's an issue that comes in and out of domestic politics with a lot of complexity. Let me stop there.
One more question before we start taking questions from the audience. I want to take or ask you to comment a little bit on an outside perspective, right? And by outside meaning just not up in the Northeast Asia region. ASEAN was mentioned in this joint statement, that there were commitments made to ASEAN as part of these trilateral meetings. You had mentioned earlier, what you've seen over the course of time of kind of South Korean opinion around China kind of dropping off the cliff. Just kind of looking at some of this, and this is just personal observation. When I used to travel to the region on a regular basis, in the beginning when China started to kind of get further out to the world and start to be economically engaged in ways that it hadn't been, let's say, in the 80s and 90s and whatnot, I thought there was a lot of acceptance of China. You could just see that in the conversations that you had with people, whether that's on the business front, the governmental fronts, or whatever it happened to be. But then slowly that started to walk itself back. I think to the point that you're making about South Korea, saw that a lot in the ASEAN conversations, where the people became much more wary about, well, what does it mean? And is that, what are the tentacles as well? And kind of what cost does it come with in addition to the economic benefits that you might be seeing? So the ASEAN side, how did they view the relationship, if you can comment on that? And what was the commitment made to ASEAN in the trilateral meetings?
Good question. Look, I'll take that second part first. I think that, to me, this has always been, and I think this is a piece of unfinished business coming out of the summit, because I think the U.S., South Korea, and Japan have always sort of tried to, groped is the wrong word, but stumbled, or they've always tried to figure out how to interlock these Northeast Northeast Asia alliances, and then kind of what does that look like with ASEAN? And it's always been kind of a work in progress, and it's been, I guess you'd say, sort of rather soupy. So I think it's still a work in progress in terms of where we go from here. And I always find that there are statements about this in joint statements or communiques. There's language about it, but it never seems to take hold, right? I think where the opportunity really comes in the short term is on the softer side, in terms of, the Koreans especially are, K-pop and K-drama is unbelievably popular in Southeast Asia. I mean, so much so that presidential candidates in Indonesia were giving themselves Korean names, right? I mean, that's how popular it is there, right? And so to me, it feels like might be better off. Some of the early footholds might be better off trying to figure out how to harness this with, soft power, move that forward, and then try to figure out maybe some of the tougher, harder security and economic issues and stop there.
Thank you, Mark. We're going to turn it over to audience questions now. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. I'll recognize you. We'll get a microphone to you because we are recording this event, so we want everybody to be able to hear this. And then when you get the microphone, please introduce yourself and ask a question. Over here? Yeah, you had your hand up, yes? Okay. It's on.
All right. So my name is Sergi, and my question has to do with the regime conflict theory of IR. So the existential conflict, so to speak, between China and North Korea on the one hand and Japan, South Korea on the other. So it has two parts. One is whether you subscribe to this basic notion that there is, by the very nature of democracy and market capitalism, those two sides are locked in this existential conflict, and whether you have seen the manifestations of awareness, particularly in South Korea, that the model of South Korean government, its way of doing things, its way of life, is in existential threat to North Korea, whether this reflective notion is present in South Korea. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, look, I don't know where to start on this one. There's a lot there. I guess what I would say is a couple things. First, I mean, what's interesting is I think remember the summit between one of the summits between Kim Jong-un and President Trump. The Trump team tried to kind of show the North Koreans, look, there's that a free market and opening up isn't a bad thing, and look at Vietnam, and there's a proximate example, and you should think about that to try to get, I think, exactly as you're saying, part of the motivation for that is to perhaps lessen the tension and make it easier for the sides to cooperate. I think that's part of their theory of the case, right? If you can get movement on openness there, it might be easier to start real negotiations and get out of this conflict that's basically been frozen for 6 years and is the most heavily militarized border in the world, with nuclear weapons on one side and a very capable conventional force backed with the nuclear weapons power on the other, right? So that is pretty high and heavy foreign policy there. So I think that's what they were trying to do, is move them to a different model to get them, to make it easier. That's the first point. I do think that, look, you're seeing, I'm not going to make it my own comment, but I think, if you talk to Sid Seiler or some of the other experts on North Korea, I think they would argue that part of the reason you are seeing the North Koreans give up on unification, for lack of a better term, tearing down statues, all that, is that it's what they're confronted with is, if there was some sort of unification, you could easily end up with basically the the West German absorption model of the East. And I think there is trepidation on North on that score. And it's in part, I think the other part of that is doubling down on the nuclear weapons program, right, to ensure regime survival. So I think that's the dynamic there. And I'll just get off the stage by saying, I think that's what makes part and parcel what makes this problem so hard, right? Because I think that, the North sees concessions and openness and all of that as, in part of it, a threat to the regime, right? How do you ensure survival if you're the North Korean regime and you're dealing with a South that has just eclipsed you in democracy, capitalism, cultural influence, international influence? That makes it harder to solve over time, paradoxically.
Thank you, Mark. We'll take one from over here on this side.
Hi, my name's Kenneth Newman. I live in the community here. Both my father and uncle served during the Korean War. My uncle saw combat, so I've always had an interest. So the issues of North Korea's rocketry program, are we every day going on to a potential hit of Japan by accident? Is it getting more dangerous, or do you think the North Korean missiles will get able to be farther? And at the same time, the munition factories in North Korea, which are sending howitzer material, whatever, to Russia, is there going to be a point where the U.S. is that happening by railroad, or is it happening by ship to Vladivostok? Is there going to be a point where a U.S. sub may have to take those North Korean ships out?
Yeah, good questions. On the Japan piece, maybe I'll make a broader statement, answer the question. But first, anytime you're launching, any sort of missiles, right? Be it, whatever the range, in close proximity to population centers, without necessarily having all of your guidance and command systems, telemetry, all of that honed, it's dangerous, right? And so, I think that is a constant concern, right? That you end up with, some sort of misfire, and then you force people to respond, kind of a guns of August kind of situation, right? So that's one, and that goes also for the demilitarized zone, where you've just got all of that, concentrated, military equipment, firepower, whatever term you want to use there. That's always been a concern, and I think will continue to be. And I think it's as these launches continue and there are less consequences at the Security Council and elsewhere, that's not a great place to be. That's one. I mean, the counter to that is then you've got to get very good on missile defense quickly, or move into an evolutionary technology like directed energy, right? And directed energy is coming. It's been in all of that, but missile defense generally is hard. It's expensive, all of that. And you got to layer it. It's just so it's always easier, almost universally on everything. It's easier to play offense than defense, right? And that's the concern there. I think on the second point, I'm not an expert on how the munitions are being shipped, but what I've heard from other experts is it's basically by rail. So the old kind of the Bush administration proliferation security initiative efforts or the interdiction efforts really are difficult, if not impossible, to stop. We'll stop there.
Here in the second row. Thank you.
Thank you. As you mentioned that in 2000...
Can you introduce yourself?
Oh, sorry, yeah. I'm so sorry. I'm Alan. I'm a history major in the college. As you mentioned, in 2018 and 19, Kim Jong-un and Trump has their meeting, and we can see that Biden has kind of very different diplomacy style with North Korea in his administration. And in the past, North Korea had many interactions with different different administrations of America. And that changed a lot with American different presidents. How do you think that the United States will reestablish, basically trust in North Korea? Because so many different presidents, so many different diplomacy, and so many different strategy. How do you think that the United States could maintain some consistency with changing presidents to North Korean policy?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think, especially between, which I mentioned before, the transition between Clinton and Bush, I mean, that was a sea change in the direction where the U.S. went, right? And, I think if you ask, even Colin Powell even testified to this, that, look, the agreed framework was generally a good thing. I mean, you have plutonium, uranium, programs. Okay, you had one was surreptitious and covert and revealed after the fact, but you plugged one and you had a process around it. And all of a sudden then you didn't, and you basically tried to recreate that construct under the six-party talks, and we are where we are today, and part of that. So I think, there is something about continuity of approaches. I think this time around it was much less salient because I think the symmetry had essentially fizzled out. I think the North Koreans were upset by the summit in Vietnam. I think the President Trump, I think if you asked him, he would say he made his best efforts, and there wasn't much more road to go, meeting leader to leader. You'd have to ask him. I don't speak for him, but I think that was the feeling of some of the Trump team members, that there wasn't a lot more utility in this, given what the North had put on the table. I think to me the bigger driver, though, and I do take the point that the continuity is difficult. Look, the North has just not been serious about negotiations. I would argue, you can argue the six-party talks was the last. I guess you could argue the Leap Day deal was probably the last real effort, but there just hasn't been a lot of seriousness of purpose on the North side. And to quote Yoon Myung-se, the South Korean foreign minister under Park Geun-hye, he would always say it takes two to tango, right? And you do kind of need a North Korean entity that or interlocutor that comes to the table, is willing to get into good faith negotiations and make some progress. I just think you have not really had that. And my best evidence of that would be, even during the summits, even when you had, for a long time there were a lot of people who said if you just get the leaders in the room, that will start unlocking things. And what was put on the table was very, very modest and kind of outdated. Now you can say, well, we should have played more hands and we should have met again, but even still, I mean, I think that was the U.S. side, I think, was at that point fatigued and exhausted on that point. So we'll stop there.
The young lady in the third row.
I'm Madison. I'm a current grad student at Harris here at U Chicago. I have a question regarding what you mentioned before, like steps moving forward, more specifically developing technology and new frontiers. So I believe it was this past December that Prime Minister Kishida announced that that there's going to be Samsung collaborating with Tokyo, and they're going to open a semiconductor research facility in Japan. So my question do you think that will be an effective solution to solidify and progress the relationship? I mean, with China as a common enemy and then the Fab Four to decide to keep China out of that market? Or do you think it'll have the potential to create a greater divide between the populations, as obviously Korea will have to invest in infrastructure, and I mean Japan has its current market that does protect Japanese industries. So my question would be, do you think that this will be good or bad?
Yeah, I mean, what I would say writ large, let's go broader, because I think your question really is a good one, and I wouldn't pretend to speak for Samsung here. I'd get myself in trouble, and I don't intend on coming to try to get fired tonight. But anyway, I think
we'll edit that out.
I'll edit that. All right, that's great.
Say what you like.
Sorry. No, I remember I was the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Asia Pacific, and it was like Secretary Hagel's second day on the job, and I was doing a public event, and they kept asking me over and over, what will Hagel do about this? What will Hagel do about this? I say, well, first of all, he's been in the office for like 48 hours, and second of all, I don't want to get fired today, So it's been a time-honored strategy that I've employed. But I would say the broader question, as I do think, generally speaking, there is widespread support for deeper economic ties between Japan and Korea. They've had a long-standing trade relationship over many, many years, and I do think when the relationship gets most heated is when you start to see the economic sanctions, right? You saw the white list, that back and forth. That's when I think a lot of people in Washington said, wow, this is a real problem. This is beyond the usual back and forth of a complicated, historically complicated relationship, that we are really going to a certain level because the economic piece is now being put in place. So what I would say is on the upside is, generally speaking, the more cross-investment, cross-trade, I think there's a lot of acceptance for that in both. And I think it really does strengthen the relationship between the two countries, and I think it's a good thing. I think the final point is, you have to, both sides, have very, very good trade negotiators. They have very strong industrial policies. They're very, they're very smart on how they work, I think, with the governments in terms of the investments they make, in terms of the policies they effectuate. So that is not an uncomplicated space, but to me that's a different space than kind of historical animus. That is a kind of a trade negotiating, industrial policy alignment space that I think is a healthy space in which to have, you can have friction there from time to time. But I think that's a very healthy space for two great nations to be in a very important dialogue, especially around sensitive technologies.
Over here in the second row.
Hi, thanks for being here. I'm Seth Poling, second year at the college. I just had a quick question about the trilateral partnership between Korea, the U.S., and Japan. I just wanted to get your perspective, Ambassador, on who exactly this partnership is directed towards. Is it directed towards China? Is it directed towards North Korea? Is it directed towards Russia? And then could you elaborate a little bit more on what the exact catalyst was for this trilateral partnership? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a really good question. What I would say is I think there is sort of almost the direction. I don't think it's directed at any one thing, right? I think nobody asked that question about the ANZUS relationship, right? And we have a treaty alliance with Australia. The Australians have their alliance with the Kiwis. We used to be allies until 1982, but that's a trilateral relationship that's gotten much healthier over the last, I would argue, 10 years, including the restoration of military relations with the Kiwis. But nobody says, well, what's this for, right? Where does this go? Kind of, you see it as a global good, right? I think that's where it starts. Now, then I think you get into elements of where that trilateral cooperation might go. There's always been a strong trilateral component about North Korea, right? There's deep concern from all three capitals. That has been, I think, front and center. I think you can argue it's shifting into areas around China to some extent, but I'd also say a lot of it is about deepening cooperation across the economic pieces because the economies are so strong. They sit on so many sensitive technologies, right? And I think there's that piece. And then I'd say, remember, there's a lot of global benefit to this as well. Remember, it wasn't too long ago when Vice President Biden was talking about trilateral work on his cancer moonshot, right? So you have, I would say there are pieces to this that apply in different spaces, to different regions, and often to different functions. And I think that's what it's at. Let me get off the stage by saying, I think it's also the challenge, right? Because some of these, groupings you get into and you're like, let's do everything, right? And we're going to do a trilateral, hamburger eating contest or whatever. And, I think I think that's where the leaders and the secretaries and the assistant secretaries need to sort of start about kind of thinking through ruthless prioritization, especially with all this momentum, on what buckets do they want cooperation and where is the priority for those buckets going forward. And that is not an easy or enviable task.
A couple more hands here. Up here in the second row, please.
Thank you for being here. I'm Dave. I'm U of C alumni. You mentioned areas that might see potential benefits. I was wondering if you saw something in particular that would be a likely next step.
Yeah, this is the prioritization piece. It's a good question. I mean, I tend to think that there's just a lot there around on the technology side. That to me seems easier to coordinate. That seems to be where all sides have strong advantages. They have all, and while there is some overlap, there is a lot of symbiotic pieces to that. So I think if I were sitting there, that's kind of where I would go. Now, that gets complicated because you've got private companies, you've got intellectual property, you've got private companies compete, rightly so. But I think sort of coordinating, a couple of big projects, I think where everybody could work together, I think that would be very interesting. I think there's already work on kind of aligning systems in terms of investment and export controls and things like that. I think that's also another place you could go as well. But that's my where the administrations are. I just don't have a good sense coming out of the summit on what exactly they want to do next. I think it'll be interesting to see when Prime Minister Kishida comes to Washington, what, if any, mention there is on the trilateral piece, and if there is more clarity on where they're going to head after that.
We have two more hands, so we'll take those on the left here.
Ambassador, thank you so much for all of your comments. My name's Layla. I'm a graduate student. I have appreciated hearing all your insight on the trilateral alliance between the U.S., Japan, and Korea, but especially in the Pacific. I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on the trilateral relationship between Taiwan, Korea, and Japan, and how you see that relationship developing. Is it, across industry, across defense, even like from an alliance perspective? Where do you see that going in the next couple of years?
Yeah, great point. First, just, for the record, I think it's important to say, look, we have a bilateral alliance with Japan. We have a bilateral alliance with Korea. We do not, the South Koreans and Japanese obviously do not have it. So it's not a NATO structure. It's two bilateral alliances, then kind of working to get closer. So I think that's important. On the relationship with Taiwan, it's really interesting. That's kind of that's an all-day seminar, of which I am not equipped to teach. But what I would say is the Japanese, the most sensitive issue obviously is sort of the political space and the military space, right? Because of the Taiwan status and all that. The Japanese have moved pretty aggressively in terms of their relationship with Taiwan, and that's been a very interesting thing. And what's also been interesting is the South Koreans, 5 years ago, you would say they would be very trepidatious about Taiwan, right, and being very overt about it. But both Moon Jae-in, the progressive president, and Yoon Suk-yeol put strong language in joint statements with the U.S. So I think those relationships are developing. Part of it, if you're asking me the theory of the case, I think that both the South Koreans and the Japanese have been convinced that if they're silent and they're not sending strong diplomatic signals, then tensions could ratchet up to certain levels and things could spiral, and that they're better off trying to play a more of a preventative role, because it's in nobody's interest, in Seoul or Tokyo, to have some conflagration in Taiwan, right? So a little bit of preventive medicine, especially on the diplomatic side, and maybe a little bit on the political side as well, and a little bit maybe on the military side, I think is kind of where they think might help, ironically, by being tougher or stronger, reduce incentives for bigger problems down the road. Let me put it that way.
And we have time for one last question, I think, in the back here.
Majimakuro, as they say in Korea.
Thank you again for coming. I'm Jake. I'm a third year in the college. I was actually also going to ask about Taiwan. So we'll zero in on the issue of those core technologies that you were talking about. Given the precarious political status of Taiwan, what collaboration have we seen? Will we be able to continue to see around Taiwan's status as a leader in various technologies like semiconductors, both in terms of Taiwan and U.S. collaboration and then jointly with like all four countries?
Yeah, I mean, I think this isn't Taiwan specific, but let me just maybe broaden it and I'll get to the Taiwan piece. I think what coming out of the pandemic, the U.S. administration recognized that they are, I would say, overly dependent. I would almost put it in two buckets. One, core national security technologies, and two, critical, I guess you'd sort of say, supply chain issues, right? And there's a lot of overlap between the two, but some go into F-35s and you absolutely have to have them, and others are more, important issues for everyday life, right? But so I think what they recognize is there is not enough onshore, or at least in friendly or allied countries, and that's kind of where the discussion is now. I think with Taiwan, you've got, TSMC controls huge amounts of the foundry business in semiconductors, right? They started it, right? And it's a really remarkable, part of Taiwan. But I think the U.S. part and parcel of the CHIPS program, where they've rolled out $50+ billion, is to try to bring more of that semiconductor manufacturing back into the U.S. And I think that's part in recognition that there are, that distant manufacturing hubs in Asia in times of crisis, no matter what, pose unique risks to the United States. I think that's one. The other thing I would say just quickly is, what's interesting here is that if you talk to semiconductor experts, I am not one of those. There was, and this will be something that the administration has to sort of figure out, is that there was a deliberate decision in the 90s to decouple those companies who do design from manufacturing, right? Very few companies do both. Samsung is one. Very proud of that. But the design, it did unleash, by decoupling, great innovation in design, right? Broadcom, NVIDIA, Qualcomm, all these guys who do design, that's leading edge. And then I think what they recognize, they've got to get more of the actual manufacturing back here. And that's almost an entirely different business. I mean, it's just a very difficult thing. So how the U.S. sort of juggles keeping the innovation, dealing with manufacturing, and then how you then balance that with the Taiwan manufacturing is just going to be a really important policy issue going forward. Let me stop there.
Well, we're going to have to close up now, but before, a couple of thank yous. First, I want to thank the iHouse team. Jocelyn, Gabrielle, Arturo, Takeshi, Avinash for helping to put together tonight's program. I again want to thank our great partners over at CEAS for their continued joint collaborative efforts together with us. I want to thank all of you for joining us here tonight. If you enjoyed today's program, I hope you'll come back. We do about 100 programs in the Global Voices Performing Arts and Lecture Series programming series every year. And so there's lots of different things for people to come and enjoy. And of course, please join me in thanking Mark.
Excellent.